All right, guys. I think right now it's 3:01. We have close to 30 people in the call. I think perhaps we can start with the introduction first to make sure that we make full use of the time that we have today. It's a lovely Saturday afternoon, and I understand that some of you might have plans after this webinar. So, without further ado, maybe I will just start with some introduction, and perhaps when we're done with it, surely more people will have joined us by then. All right. First of all, hello everyone, and thank you for joining to the first webinar of Sustain Kita SOS Climate Code Red Program. So this is our first webinar, and it's entitled Challenges and Solution of Climate Change. So if you have joined us from our first event, which is the Carbon Calculator workshop that happened on 5th of January, we thank you so much for the support. And this webinar is a continuation of that program. And of course, we have a few more coming up in later months that I'll share with you in a bit. Okay. Of course, from this call itself, I do see familiar faces who have joined us from the last workshop, and we're very happy to welcome you back again. And for those who have just joined our program for the very first time, thank you for joining. Thank you for taking time out on a Saturday to listen to two esteemed speakers that we have today to speak more on climate change. All right. So before anything, let me perhaps share a screen, and I'll run through with everyone on some basic house rule, the agenda, and also what is Sustain Kita and what is this program about. Yep. Okay, I've just shared my screen. Hopefully, it's appearing on your end. If it's not, please let me know, or maybe perhaps the team can give me a nudge. So I will just proceed with it. All right. Okay. So, well, of course, for every event, we have very, very simple house rule to make sure that this event can run as smooth as possible and making sure there's no interruption to the experience that we're having from this event. So, first of all, I'd like to remind everyone to stay muted. If you just joined, please make sure you are muted unless you have any questions to ask, to share. And if you do have questions, do raise your hands or type in the chat box. There will be a Q&A at the end of this session where we can perhaps invite you to speak directly or engage directly with the speaker if you wish. If not, as a host, as a moderator, I'm able to also ask the question on your behalf. All right. Second part, if you are joining us on any of the devices, feel free to turn your camera on, and you can always use the background picture that we share in the chat box, to join in us to share the spirit. If not, if you're shy, it's okay. You can just keep yourself hidden. But we do have a Q&A, so maybe by then we do hope that you can perhaps turn on your camera and to join us to take a very beautiful group picture. Okay. Last but not least, we do have a feedback form because we believe that your voice matters, and we really, really want to understand how you feel about the event. It will only take 1 to 2 minutes to answer the Google form, and we'll share a QR code at the end. All right. So really appreciate you giving us a feedback and telling us how you feel about the event. Right. Moving on. So, just want to bring through everyone the simple agenda that we'll be having today for the 1.5 hour that we'll be having. Right? We will have some introduction on Sustain Kita SOS Climate Code program, and then we'll take a very nice group picture. So, 3:10, we will start our panel discussion revolving around three pillars. So we have the first pillar, which is the impact of climate change, especially in Malaysia itself. We also will look into perhaps what has been done or currently being done to combat climate change in Malaysia and also on international level. Last but not least, both our speakers are very, very seasoned and experienced climate activists in their field of work. So we will definitely have them to share a little bit of tips maybe some resources available on how you, very passionate youth on climate change, can take action as well from within your capacity. All right. We do allocated time for Q&A. So the Sustain Heater team will definitely share a Slido link in the chat box itself for you to deposit your questions there. So once during the Q&A session, we'll flash the screen and we will try to answer the questions, share, and we address with the speaker. Of course, if you have any particular question to address to any speaker, you can put a note there, maybe questions to Dr. Renard or questions to Aidil, and you can list down the questions there. So we will address it accordingly. And last but not least, we have a very short feedback form. Okay, so I think as of now, perhaps I will just stop sharing for a bit. We can take a very nice group picture, okay, to commemorate this event. And once that's done, then I will continue to share a little bit more on Sustain Kita and formally introduce how amazing our speakers are today. All right. So for this part, perhaps I guess Kenny could help us to unspotlight the speakers for this session and try to capture the group picture in a gallery view from your screen. All right. So Kenny, whenever you're ready, I'll give you to lead this session.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you, just Jason. Let me go to the gallery view first, then I shall take a good picture. Please bear with me for a bit. Okay. If you have your camera on, please leave your cam on. And when I say ready, put out your brightest smile and let's have a group photo, okay? All right. All right, everyone. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, one more. Okay, one more. 3, 2, 1, smile. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. Thank you, everyone, for turning on your camera. Of course, I do notice the chat box itself. Patricia, you say that you're tired. I understand it's an afternoon. Maybe you had a very nice lunch. You're feeling a bit drowsy. Feel free to grab a coffee and join us on the call. And of course, I would guarantee you that the content that will be discussed later will be very interesting, and hopefully that will brighten you up and make energize you again. So let me go back to my screen sharing to continue to share a little bit on Sustain Kita. All right. So just to share with everyone, Sustain Kita is actually we started off as an initiative in December 2022 by a group of scholars. We all studied back in UK university. So once we graduated, we came back and we noticed that we share a very common passion in sustainability and climate change, and we want to do something about it. So from then onwards, we work with local NGOs. We work with other organizations, startups to run different events. Our key events includes the SOS podcast that currently you can find it on our YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn as well. Our website too. Our official website. Where we have 4 episodes so far that we record with corporate leaders like Post Malaysia, or we recorded with other engineers as well to talk about EV, to talk about renewable energies, and many more interesting content. So SOS Climate Code Red is actually a program, a program that we participate in WWF, World Wildlife Fund Malaysia's Eco Warrior Program as part of their seed grant initiative. So what happened here is that we got supported from WE Malaysia financially to run events for youth that revolve around climate change. As you can see today, this is our first webinar. We already done one workshop event to teach everyone how to account or measure your personal carbon footprint on Fifth itself. And today we are doing this on climate change. So if you're interested to join our upcoming webinars or even the workshop happening in February and March, feel free to scan this QR code I can see on the screen right now to register yourself. And of course, if you want to learn more about the program in general, you can always scan this QR code to look for the program booklet that is available on our Google Drive. Alternatively, you can also go to our Instagram to look at the program booklet posts that we've just created very recently that would perfectly summarize everything that we have about this program. Last but not least, if you have any question, you want to do collaboration, you're interested to join us as a volunteer, as a youth ambassadors, you can always email us at sustainkeater.marketing@gmail.com and we'll respond to you promptly. Okay? All right. So now things get more interesting. I'm getting very excited here because today we have two esteemed speakers, panelists that we invited to talk to you all today. First of all, we have Dr. Renard Siew, and also we have Aidil Iman. So let me share a little bit more about these two amazing climate advocate and their achievement in the past. First of all, let me start with Dr. Renard. Dr. Renard is the founding and current president of the Malaysia Carbon Market Association, MCMA, where he spearheads efforts to develop Malaysia's carbon trading system and advocate for leveraging carbon credit as market-based solution to combat climate change. In 2020, Dr. Renard was honored as a SDG champion by the World Economic Forum, WEF, in recognition of his outstanding contributions to advance climate action and drive progress on the Sustainable Development Goals SDG. Recognized globally for his leadership in sustainability, Dr. Renard was also selected as a Forbes Fellow, and he also represented Malaysia at the inaugural UN Climate Action Summit in New York, a milestone event in the global fight against climate change. So currently, Dr. Renard, he leads corporate sustainability for Yinson Group, serving as their head of sustainability, where his vision continues to shape impactful and transformative initiative within the industry itself. So welcome, Dr. Renard. Thank you so much for joining us. Second panelist that we have today is none other than Aidil Iman, a remarkable young leader making waves in the climate action space. Aidil founded Kolektif Iklim in 2022 as a youth-led environmental initiative dedicated to strengthen the connection between climate action and biodiversity protection in Malaysia. He then founded Jejak in 2024, a project aimed at enhancing biodiversity identification and species literacy among youth Malaysian. So if you're interested, definitely go to Instagram, LinkedIn to look up for these two NGO where he do many engaging and meaningful initiatives around biodiversity conservation. And of course, his expertise and passion have earned him a seat on the Climate Change Consultation Panel and the Climate Change Youth Cluster under the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability, NRES, where he provides valuable insights to shape Malaysia's national climate change strategy and ambitions. Aidil also served as a youth climate champions consultant for UNICEF Malaysia, contributing significantly to UNICEF climate and environmental advocacy efforts. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Renard and Aidil Iman, two visionary change makers who are driving Malaysia's climate and environmental sustainability agenda forward. So please give them a virtual round of applause to formally welcome these two amazing speakers to join us today. Right? Okay, Kenny, could you have to spotlight? I think okay, sorry, I think it was already done. So Dr. Rana and Aidil, feel free to unmute yourself. We will start the webinar now. All right, we will just have the panel discussion. So first of all, how are you two doing? Are you two excited? How are you feeling right now?
Oh, hey, hello. Hello, everyone. I think it's so great to be here. Thank you to Sustain Kita for having me on a Saturday afternoon for that matter. So great to see all of you, budding change makers who are here. and really looking forward to our conversation on SOS, right? Climate Rate Alert, and what are some of the things that we can do collectively to help drive change in Malaysia and beyond.
Thank you. Aidil, how about you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's a great Saturday. It's a productive time to spend with the rest of the participants and the team at Sustain Kita through this project to talk about a very pressing issue in this nation and globally. So I'm really excited to talk about how we can mobilize, how we can create an impact. Yeah, I'm really excited. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, great. Good to hear that from both speakers itself. And again, on behalf of Sustain Kita, I'd like to express our utmost gratitude for you two to take time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And I believe personally we met the two of you all for the first time during the book launch event by YB Nick Nasmi, the Minister of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability in Sentul. So it was an amazing session. And just to share with everyone, these two speakers are incredible individual that is recognized by the minister himself. And we were so honored to have both of them today with us. All right. So without further ado, I think I will just start running through the questions to both speakers, and we could get this exciting ball rolling. So the first questions I'd like to perhaps address to both speakers. According to a report by UN United Nations in May 2023, it was revealed that climate change and intensifying extreme weather events have led to a five-fold increase in natural disaster worldwide, in Malaysia and different countries as well. And this happened over the past 50 years. This has also resulted in over 2 million deaths worldwide and 4.3 trillion USD in economic losses. So, in that context, with the growing global impact of climate change, what effect has it had on Malaysia in the recent year? Perhaps I could have Dr. Renard to start first.
Yeah, sure. Perhaps to paint the context, I think all of you know that, there is this magic number, right? 1.5 degrees Celsius that we're trying to cap temperatures from increasing by. And you hear a lot of that in social media, from the IPCC report, among many others. And why is this number so important? I think scientists have clearly warned us that, we have less than a decade left, right, to actually cap, the increase of temperatures from going up to this figure. And it's also partly because when there's an increase in temperature, what happens is you will see a huge correlation with extreme weather events that are happening across the world. Data from NASA dating all the way back to the 1950s, right? And once again, this was also part of my research when I was doing, like civil and environmental engineering at my school back then. You can see that the world tends to take on what we call, mean temperatures almost fell into a perfect bell-shaped curve. But just over the couple of decades, right, we're seeing mean temperatures really shifting, right, towards the higher end. So extreme weather events, right, floods, droughts, wildfires, they used to cover only about 0.1% of our Earth's surface. But in the 2000s, we're seeing that number increasing to about 14%, It's almost 14 times more likely for us to be experiencing, such catastrophic events in this day and age. Of course, this can be fact-checked as well. I mean, if you read in the media very recently, with the LA wildfires that have been happening, the floods, that is almost a back-to-back event, right, across different cities. Even in Kuala Lumpur, like the place where a lot of us are based in, right, the Klang Valley. I think in 2021 we had one of the most devastating floods, right, that has ever occurred, hitting actually right smack, in the city area. So this is not just a rural problem; it's also very much right affecting city dwellers. So going back to the statistics that Jason had pointed out, right, this is something that is very serious because it continues to affect livelihoods of people. We actually have deaths occurring, right, as a result of floods. In 2021 alone, we had more than 50 plus fatalities that had occurred. And once again, this is something that angers me quite a fair bit because in some of my work with Send GPS back then, right, I think we had already forewarned that a lot of this devastating impacts was going to come, right? And we had to do something very quickly. We needed to set up those hotspots in certain areas that have been earmarked, right, for floods. But yet nothing, happened. Like we were just told that, oh, everything was under control. Like we had mitigation, adaptation studies out there that are already sufficient in order to help us adapt, right, to the changing climate. But the reality is that, as climate change continues to worsen over time, right, what is seen as a 1 in 100 year flood events, right, are in fact happening more frequently. I think I have to caveat here by saying that when a lot of people think about 1 in 100 years, right, they think that, oh, this is really an event that's only going to happen, 100 years from now, right? But the reality that it's a probabilistic mathematical term that people use. It's really trying to quantify the probability of something happening. And of course, that frequency of extreme weather events that I've mentioned earlier is happening more frequently. So what perhaps is seen as 1 in 100 years, right? And perhaps the next couple of years, you hear it being 1 in 50 years event, or perhaps even 1 in 10 year event, right? So what that means for us is that we have to adapt to the changing realities of this. It's affecting livelihoods that I've mentioned earlier, right? So just to give you an example, the situation in Malaysia, 1 degree Celsius of increase in temperature alone, right, could lead to about 2 to 3%, right, of crop yield decline, right? So typically, a lot of people think that, oh, 2 to 3% doesn't seem like a big number in terms of crop yield, right? But for a country like us, right, in Malaysia, it actually affects, like our self-sufficiency ratio, like in terms of the adequacy of food distribution, or whether we need to actually import, right, more food, right, from some of our neighboring countries. So in some ways, it does have an impact. Of course, water as well. Water security is another area that people don't tend to think about. So we have actually seen, right, water levels in some of our dams in certain parts of Selangor actually declining year on year. And it's because of this phenomenon called intervariability of rainfall. So just to sort of explain it in layman's term, right? Areas that used to get, tumultuous amounts of rainfall no longer get that same amount of rainfall as they used to. It's more sporadic, if you like. And a lot of this actually affects things like water security. In the 21st century, you're turning on taps, right? And suddenly you're like, oh, there's not enough water flowing through your pipes. Right? One of the reasons, right, is also, apart from water pollution, of course, right, that you've been hearing in the news, it's also linked very much to climate change. So the impacts that we're seeing here is very severe. It affects livelihoods, but of course, needless to say, it is also an economic threat. So when crop yields decline, right, we can't feed our population. Agriculture farmers, specifically those in both the northern and southern regions of Peninsular Malaysia, right, are severely affected. In the IPCC report, right, what has come out to the forefront is this double whammy effect, right? So farmers are experiencing not just severe floods at one period, but this is followed immediately by also prolonged droughts. So it's very hard for them, right, to continue to plant, right, and to gain sufficient income, right, to sustain themselves as a result of that. This, once again, are very real problems that we are facing. And I can speak almost an hour, right, around the economic impacts, but I think I'll probably pause there. I think it's enough for all of us to just acknowledge that climate change is truly the defining issue of our generation, and it is, as this webinar has so rightly aptly titled, right, SOS, right, climate is a code red for humanity.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Renard. I really agree with you, especially on how climate events are happening more frequently in the past few years. As you said earlier itself, the flood that we had in December 2021 in Malaysia, it affects across 11 states, not just a rural area, but also urban area like KL, Selangor. And we do understand from report from CNA that causes a 6.1 billion ringgit in Malaysia economic loss, including 50 deaths and also displacing over 125K people in Malaysia. So thank you so much on that. Maybe Aidil, do you have anything to add on to that? What kind of impacts that you are observing as an NGO leader on the ground?
Yeah, and I think Dr. Renard captures really much well enough of like the physical impacts that Malaysia is facing, right? Like one of the most apparent impacts is the flooding that we've had. There were people in the east coast of last year in 2024 that were saying that the flooding in Pahang, Terengganu, Kelantan, which was much more severe than the 2014 Kelantan flooding as well, right? We're seeing those kind of conversations by local people. We're seeing a lot of intensifying physical effects, but what Dr. Renard was mentioning earlier and was really in the significant point was that, how it affects different people disproportionately, right? As someone who works with young people, there are noticeable climate change impacts among children or environmental impacts amongst children, right? One of the most vulnerable groups in Malaysia when it comes to environmental catastrophes, right? For example, like how they are much more prone to flood risks or waterborne diseases during flooding season, to vector-borne diseases such as dengue, or at risk of more injuries and even death, and also the mental health issues that are associated from flooding as well. So we're seeing those kind of disproportionate effects on children, right? Children have a different type of physical attributes compared to adults. For example, they breathe more fast or rapidly than adults, so they would intake more air pollutants, right? This is very noticeable aside from the context of climate change, transboundary haze, right? During Jerebu season, where children or schools tend to get shut down. So it's not just affecting the health of children, but the systems around them. For example, children in post Kuala Lumpur and Perak have a hard time going to school because every time it's flooding season, the floods would sort of become a physical barrier for them to go to school. So these are indigenous children living in post Kuala Lumpur who could not have access to education because of physical climate change effects, right? There are other effects such as like those in Pulau Gaya who are facing sea level rise, who also cannot go to school. So the systems around children are also affected, the infrastructure of schools, the access to education, right? But it's also about the kind of adaptive capacity that we can do to combat these things, right? For example, the UNICEF report on the impacts of climate change on children say that we have innovated during COVID to suit things to online learning. So perhaps one of the ways we can adapt is to do online learning during cases of like transboundary haze season and so on. So it's really important to talk about the intersectionality of climate change and the intersectional ways that we can also adapt to climate change. I think adaptation loses its track sometimes during the climate change conversation in Malaysia. A lot of it is focused on mitigation. Even during the consultation on the and on the climate change bill, a lot of the things that were brought up by the consultants were on mitigation, and a lot of the CSOs, NGO leaders, activists in that room during that consultation, 90% of that conversation that we wanted was supposed to be on adaptation. So I think we also might want to talk about that hopefully more. But other than what Renard has been saying and what I've brought up lately, it's important to know that climate change impacts everyone, but how it impacts is disproportionate.
Wow, thank you so much, Aidil. That's a very fresh perspective. I think even as a young people myself, I did not see how disproportionate the impact were to young people, to different group of people, to children, for example, as you say, they breathe faster, so air pollution affected them a bit more. And it brings me back to the time, around September, October every single year, where a lot of schools shut down, not just in Malaysia, but in Indonesia as well, due to our haze issue that stem from peatland burning happening in our neighboring country. And that caused the quality of air to be at a very unhealthy level, and that affects a lot of people. And not to mention the physical impact of flood to schools, infrastructure, making students are not able to continue with their education. So thanks for highlighting on that. That's very eye-opening. So we talk about the challenges that we face here in Malaysia in different ways, and I felt that the mood has been a bit gloomy. So perhaps to lighten things up, let us talk about what has been done or what has been doing to combat climate change. So for this question, perhaps I'd like to direct to Dr. Renard, because I do understand that you are very this is your alley. You have been making a lot of contribution and also achievement in this sector. I think just late last year, 31st December, Malaysia submitted our first biannual transparency report (BRT) to UNFCCC. We reported a reduction in our national carbon intensity by 37.1% as of 2021, and that is measured against our overall NDC goal, National Determined Contribution Goal, of reducing our carbon intensity by 45% in 2030. So for that, right, as a seasoned corporate sustainability leader, what do you think urgent actions corporate have to take in Malaysia to support and achieve our NDC goals?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, right? Maybe starting from talking about the NDCs, the first thing that I would probably highlight is whether corporations actually understand what it means, right? So when does all of this reports, the biannual, transparency report, BTR that comes out, the 45%, emissions target against our 2005 GDP, how does that get translated, right? Through a corporate lens. One of the things that I'm finding challenge and difficulty in, and once again, this is also based on conversations that I've had with corporate sustainability practitioners, is they don't know how their roadmap that they have devised or framed within their organization actually connects or links back, right, to supporting the 45% target that they have. So there's always this back and forth conversation around, are we doing the right things? Are we truly aligning, right, to the targets that are being set? And some of them are not even, to be very frank, engaged in that conversation. So the struggle that they have is always this conversation that's happening, right, 35,000 feet above ground. They say mostly at the governmental level, ministerial level, but it doesn't really get translated down, right, through a corporate setting. So perhaps I will start from there and say that it's a huge challenge. Now, secondly, when you talk about emissions reduction specifically, if you look at some of the initiatives that Malaysia has had, just in a couple of months or years, right, we have made progress. Like there's now a call for, the National Sustainability Reporting Framework, right, which requires at least publicly listed corporations to be mandated to be more transparent in terms of their disclosures. They have to start reporting on their Scope 3 emissions. But now, bear in mind that Scope 3 emissions, right, is quite new and nascent for a lot of corporates. A lot of them have, started measuring Scope 1 and Scope 2. So I believe a lot of you have gone through the carbon calculation workshop, right? So you're probably very familiar with these terms. Scope 1 basically refers to the direct emissions that a corporation directly contributes. Scope 2 refers to indirect emissions, mostly from electricity consumption. And then for Scope 3, it's very complicated. It's got 15 categories, right? From finance emissions to supply chain emissions, to products and services. So it's a whole suite of things. And this particular category is where a lot of corporations actually struggle with. Now, a question that I'm throwing back, perhaps, right, up for discussion here is, do you think that corporates have sufficiently disclosed on Scope 3 emissions? I can tell you that a large majority of them at this point in time, right, are probably still struggling, right, to have a comprehensive disclosure, right, in this particular category. So in many sense, right, their carbon accounting reporting isn't really complete as such, right? So do you think that when they start making claims or commitments around wanting to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero, does it really make sense when your baseline isn't really complete? I don't know. This is something that I'm probably throwing back. I think there are a lot of conversations and gaps that still needs to be addressed here. And I think specifically for corporations and the private sector, there's a long way to go in terms of trying to breach existing gaps and trying to sort of connect, right, the lines with what governments, ministries are actually doing. What I'm hopeful of is that things are starting to change. Like we're seeing more apparent partnerships that are happening, but we really have to look into accelerating, right, the progress on this front, because I do feel that it's very important, right, for the private sector especially, right, to step in to lead the way if there's anything. They are coming in with good intent, I have to say, but sometimes it's just a question of they don't really know how to approach, right, or breach the gap, so to speak. So in many ways, there's always this mantra where we say you need a whole of government, all of society approach, right? And what needs to be included, I think, is also the private sector voice in this, because they do have capital and funding, but sometimes they just need a bit of guidance in terms of where to channel it towards, right, in order to help breach the so-called gap. Of course, having said so, I agree with what Aidil has said. Mitigation is really only one aspect of it, right? We must really start shifting the conversation as well towards the adaptation piece. And I think that's where, you know, a real opportunity, right, could emerge, public-private sector partnerships, right, on this front.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Renard. I do agree with you. And coming from a background of practicing sustainability in corporate setting, Scope 3 is really challenging. Honestly, I testify to that. And the fact that recently Malaysia have announced the National Sustainability Reporting Framework last year, it really shook the ground. I think a lot of corporations right now are trying and making sure that whoever falls in the three groups that was mandated, they were trying to measure their carbon accounting and also to hire to international standards like IFRS and to do TCFD as well reporting to make sure that they transparently tell the world what they are doing, what kind of actions, commitments they have to support the net zero goal. But on that front itself, I do notice, a lot of corporates are also making commitments in the recent year. You can look at perhaps our oil and gas giant like Petronas committing to net zero already in 2022. It was mentioned, net zero to achieve net zero by 2050, aligned with what Malaysia is trying to do. We have TNB as well making such a commitment. We have the food industry, FGV as well, making that too, trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And of course, post Malaysia itself, they also have that commitment since 2023 too. A lot of this were driven heavily by regulations and policies in Malaysia. So, questions to Aidil itself. As a youth consultant to Malaysia government, could you tell us a little bit more, what kind of recent policy changes that has been made to strengthen the climate action across, apart from what we have shared earlier, and what gaps still need to be addressed to accelerate this progress? Perhaps you can touch a little bit on the focus on mitigation and the negligence on adaptation. Yep, over to you, Aidil.
Yeah, I mean, there has been like a few consultations. I mean, the most recent one is on the MINAP, on the kickoff workshop that was hosted at Le Méridien when so NRES was invited, and NRES with their collaboration with Jejak, which is a German-based sustainable sort of like development kind of agency that's helping as the main consultant for the MINAP. So MINAP is the Malaysian National Adaptation Plan, right? And we had just received funding from the UN on like about $3 million to formulate this proposal on this national adaptation plan. That was in the policy participation on that was like from people from UNICEF, people from WWF, people from the corporate sector, people from the public health sector. So it was sort of like interagency as well, not just having a lot of non-state actors like NGOs and civil society and activists, but also pulling in civil servants from all aspects that were necessary to give policy when it comes to climate change and adaptation, right? So there were a lot of KKM, MOH, Ministry of Health practitioners at the workshop. So the process was about us sort of like putting a timeline on what kind of policy progress should be done. For example, before the MINAP was supposed to be published by 2026, what should we do prior, right? So what we can do is, for example, like doing a survey on health and climate change, a nationwide survey focusing maybe on vulnerable groups like children, women, indigenous peoples, talking about increasing data on health and climate change, talking about, for example, also building capacity of civil servants to have knowledge about environmental health or environmental management in generally, right? So that was one of the policy process. So I was involved with that. So it was more of like the splitters up into different groups of like, because I know that MINAP wants to target about 5 different sectors, like for example, public infrastructure, cities and urban, biodiversity and forest, water, health, and then something else, right? So we were split into groups, had a focus group discussion, but there were also other policy inputs that, Kolektif, Iklim, and other youth organizations have been involved with. For example, like the climate change bill. We've been not necessarily policy wise, but we've been involved a lot with the COP related matters. We were involved with COP28 in terms of like how to design sort of the pavilion, how to strategize the pavilion, the Malaysian pavilion at COP28 in Baku, Azerbaijan. There's going to be a post-COP, discussion and talking about the climate change bill next Thursday with a lot of youth groups. So it was sort of also good to see that the current government, the federal government, is making a lot of spaces for young people, right? So it just launched the youth cluster, which is like a youth sort of like decision-making policy kind of platform where all of the members can actually nominate other youth or youth organizations. So you actually have an opportunity as well, right? You like a person like me can nominate Sustain Kita to be a part of that panel, right? So that panel usually discusses so far on a lot of the climate change bill, a lot of on SIPA as well, like communication, education, and public awareness, a lot of on policy. So there have been a lot of progress that we've been a part of, right? You see a lot of young people participating, especially in workshops, especially in focus group discussions. We had a focus group discussion with Deloitte, one of the consultants for the climate change bill, on different areas. We had it about maybe 3 months ago in like 2024, where they organized like a 2-week focus group discussion with civil societies and for the climate change bill. And then what was really refreshing from the climate change bill process was not that it wasn't just limited to the consultation panel. So the federal government actually publicized and wanted public feedback in November into December, I think, of last year, right? They asked for public feedback from Malaysians, right? So one of the things that civil society did was this organization called KAMI, or Klima Action Malaysia. They actually did a sort of like a template for how the Malaysian public could submit their public feedback to the federal government about the climate change bill. And then it was a 1-month process, about 1 month, maybe 1 month and a half process. So it was quite refreshing to see that the federal government really wanted this public sort of like feedback or commenting to address the climate change bill, right? I wish this was the same case for a lot of like EIAs. Like a lot of Malaysians don't know that EIAs can be publicly criticized and do have a process where you can give your feedback for almost every single project that requires an environmental impact assessment. But that was the kind of policy processes that I've been involved with, Kolektif Iklim has been involved with, and that I see other organizations have been involved with. If we don't have access to those kind of policy dialogues, we tend to create them as well, right? For example, like MYD created the post-COP28 forum that discussed about, post-COP28 forum and so on, right? To discuss about what would be the policy way ahead, right? So we also noticed that kind of, situation with civil society where when we don't have access to a really important policy or legal issue about climate change, we would start it, we would kickstart it, we would mobilize it and start talking to the government and how they can collaborate with us.
Thank you so much, Aidil. I think that's very good to maybe for those who are not aware, Malaysia government, they are also, apart from introducing many relevant policies around climate change, like what Aidil said earlier, there is a climate change bill coming up soon, and there's a lot of other policies as well, like the one that was announced last year, Environmental Quality Amendments Bill 2023, where now they increased the penalty from 500K to 10 million for certain as a penalty for those who have pollute the environment in certain ways. All right, and it's very good to also see that the direction of the government, where they are trying to engage youth cluster, CSO, and other stakeholders in Malaysia as well in policy making processes through focus group study. And one thing, just to share with the audience too, Sustain Kita, we were a part of the National Planetary Action, think it's National Planetary Health Action Plan. Yeah. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, we were involved in the focus group study, and national dialogue happens last year itself, where CSO youth leaders are able to contribute certain perspective into those policies, actions, and so it really affects people on the ground, and we are able to share that too. So it's very good to know that. Aidil, thank you so much. One thing that I really wanted to know a bit more, continue on this process, it's actually on different levers for us to achieve our climate change goal, like the one that we shared earlier, our NDC goal of reducing 45 percent of carbon intensity by 2030. On that, I think recently there was a auction, Malaysia carbon credit auction held by Bursa Carbon Exchange in July, and that was the first that we had. It features carbon credit from Kwamat Rainforest Conservation Project in Sabah. So that is something groundbreaking. And carbon credit is also a hot topic lately that not just sustainability practitioners talking about, but the world is talking about it too. So fortunately, today we have a carbon credit expert here with us today. So maybe Dr. Renard, as the president of MCMA, could you explain to the audience, because we have people coming from different backgrounds, what is carbon credit and how they are able to address climate change in different contexts. So over to you, Dr. Renard.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's important to clarify that I wouldn't actually call myself a carbon credit expert. I sort of evolved into that role partly because I think there were no takers who were, daring enough to actually, take on the first role as the president of the Malaysian Carbon Market Association, to be very frank, because it is the first very much role that we have, right, in this association, and there's no guidebook to it. But I would probably start off by saying that in the carbon market space, there are two broad classifications. And I think once again, this was something that I've also shared during our minister's book launch, right? The first is what we call the compliance market, which to this date, as of 2023, actually, it was worth close to about 200 plus billion, versus the voluntary carbon markets, which is only about 2 billion. Now, the difference between a compliance market and a voluntary, from its name in itself, you can guess that in the compliance market, there is a more structured governance process, right, in actually broaching this subject. So examples of this would be in the form of, say, an emissions trading scheme, whereby different sectors would be given a certain threshold in terms of the amount that they can emit. And if they actually exceed that amount, they would then have to actually purchase, right, certain credits in order to be able to offset the threshold that has been set for them. So this has worked, like quite prominently, I guess, like in countries like in the EU and US especially, right? Another form of a compliance market would be, say, the carbon tax, for example, as a form of mechanism. So the way a carbon tax works is, if the government sort of sets a certain threshold, say 25,000 tons as a base, and if any corporations were to emit higher than this threshold, they would need to pay a certain tax to the government, in which then the government would then use that fund in order to support, I guess, more renewable energy-based projects. So these are basically the sort of two regimes, if you like, right, within the compliance market space. Now, in the voluntary carbon market, from its name, voluntary, there is no fixed threshold, right, in a sense that corporations feel that, if they've made certain carbon neutral claims, right, they can actually then go to certain markets, open markets, to purchase credits, and then they could retire those credits, right, in their accounting books to say that they have offset certain emissions that they have incurred as a result of that. So specifically in Malaysia, currently what we have is a voluntary carbon market under Bursa. Specifically, I think the exchange is called Bursa Carbon Exchange, or BCX, right? And as you've rightly pointed out, the very first Malaysian-based project that was auctioned, right, came from the Kwamat Rainforest Conservation Project. And a day before the auction took place, right, there was protests. If some of you who have been very familiar in the CSO scene, you would have probably seen that there were, I think, a group of NGOs, I think led probably by Rimba Watch, right, that actually issued a letter like a day before the auction to claim that, this is not the right mechanism or regime. And there were a lot of claims around how carbon credits are only used for the purpose of greenwashing, for instance, right? And I think this is also where we need a lot of clarification around the misinformation and disinformation, right, that happens here. Carbon credit prices have definitely plummeted, right, since the issuance of the Guardian article. So we also have to acknowledge that, as much as we want to put in safeguards on environmental and social issues, there are also some projects that are bogus projects where, some irresponsible project developers would actually overstate, right, the claims of how much carbon credits can actually be traded through a certain project. And it's bad apples like that, right, that are actually causing little faith, right, and more distrust around, the carbon market space. But I guess through COP29, one of the things that we have seen was basically more confidence being restored, right, through this market. So just to give you an idea, COP29 was very much what we call a climate finance COP. And one of the contentions or rather arguments that have come up is that in order to fulfill the gaps in terms of climate financing, which the Global North are not really, fulfilling their duties or commitments to, perhaps an alternative to actually address this is through the carbon market space. And when we talk about the carbon markets or carbon projects specifically, at the end of the day, one credit needs to represent one ton of emissions, right, that is either sequestered or removed, right? And to actually register for a carbon project, there's actually a lot of pre-requirements that needs to be addressed. Like for instance, there are safeguards from a governance perspective that says that there should not be any double counting. So if a corporation or whoever, right, that has already purchased a certain set of credits and retire them, right, they cannot be reused for another project. I think that needs to be very clear, right, upfront. And secondly, you have to fulfill this condition of what we call the principle of additionality. So if a project can already go ahead anyways, right, without additional funding from the sale of carbon credits, then technically that project should not qualify, right, to for you to have any issuance at all of carbon credit. So there's actually this long list, right, of pre-requirements that actually needs to be fulfilled. And there are certain bodies, right, for example, the Integrity Council of Voluntary Carbon Markets, that is actually trying to promote and govern this. And they're really trying to push for different markets, right, to basically adopt these principles in order to safeguard integrity and credibility. So the market has definitely evolved. Like since then, there's a lot of conversation. But I would probably say that at MCMA, one of the things that we are trying to promote, right, is to make sure that the Global South continues to have a voice, right, on such roundtables. At the moment, 70% of the carbon credits that you see are being issued in the markets, right, are dominated by independent standards by RERA. So there's this argument about, hey, should Malaysia perhaps have its own national standards, given the fact that our neighboring countries like Indonesia and Thailand already have their own? Can we promote some sort of ASEAN common carbon framework, right, to facilitate mutual recognition around the standards? There's a lot of very interesting conversations that are basically evolving. But suffice to say that one of the things that we would not compromise, right, is of course the integrity of the use of carbon credits. A lot of us feel that there needs to be a mitigation hierarchy before corporates can actually use carbon credits. So meaning to say corporates must first and foremost demonstrate, right, that they've done everything that they can in order to cut down on their emissions. They can embark on carbon reduction projects, carbon removal through carbon capture. And then once they've done everything that they possibly can and they cannot do anything else, right, then they really should look into the purchase of high quality carbon credits, right, in order to achieve those offsets, as opposed to doing nothing really. And specifically for scope 3 emissions, as we spoke about, right, when you talk about indirect emissions, it's very hard for corporations, right, to step in to really do something about it. They can be more selective with the suppliers that they adopt. They can issue policies and say that, supplier ABC, these are the things that you need to do. But bear in mind that these are also SMEs, right, which may not have the financial capacity in order to be able to drive action. So the purchase of carbon credits, right, could represent, right, an opportunity to channel those funding in order to be able to support them. And I guess I'll probably stop there because once again, this is a very big topic, right? We could spend a whole day, right, just talking about where some of the challenges are, where are the opportunities, what are some of the safeguards really that needs to be in place.
All right, Dr. Renard, thank you so much. Even me myself, I learned a lot from what you shared earlier, and I really want to stress on the last point that you shared, especially on mitigation hierarchy, where for even for corporation to achieve the net zero target by 2050, we have to demonstrate that 90% of the emission, whether it's scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3, it's already mitigated through emission reduction initiative before we could pursue a different instrument as well. But carbon credit as an instrument for us to mitigate emission is also very important, and it addresses the gaps that it's presence for corporations, for countries to take action against climate change. I think that wraps up the pillar number 2, action that's being done to combat climate change. And seeing the time that we have right now, let us go into the last theme that we have today, which is on youth participation in climate change. So, Aidil, I do know that you have started your journey as a climate youth activist at the age of 19 back in 2019 before you start your NGOs. So you've come a long way to become a leading voice as you are today. And from your perspective, what do you think are the maybe give us one biggest barrier that you like yourself face in taking action on climate change, and how maybe other stakeholders can support them in overcoming this challenge?
Yeah, and I think, when I was doing my sort of undergraduate thesis, I did it on the youth participation of Malaysian youth in at the UNFCCC through climate diplomacy. So I was doing a focus group discussion. I was doing individual interviews with young people who have attended COP before, right? Learning about their experiences. Like I've interviewed people from MYD, people from the Loss and Damage Coalition, people from Third World Network, people from Climate Action, people from UNICEF about how they were feeling sort of like, and the experience were what were the limitations. And the answers, this was the same answer that I gave during the last session that I had during the book launch, was that young people, when accessing, for example, this sort of big platform on climate change, right? A conference on climate change, right? Talking about negotiations on climate finance, right? Talking about adaptation goals at the global level and so on. The main problem would always be funding, right? And the financial and logistical problems will always be the number one barrier, right? So these are youth or young people who are using their own money to buy plane tickets to Baku in Azerbaijan, to stay in very shady neighborhoods in apartments or Airbnb, who do not have the necessary or financial capacity that is backing them up, right, to go there, right? They are collecting their own batches to go to COP. They are trying to they have to, if they are an NGO, they have to collect public donations, right? Making a social media post to talk about how can they ask the public to fund their activities at COP, right? So financial problems will always be one of the main barrier of youth, sort of like, at least for existing young people who have so many things in what they want to do, right? So that will always be a main challenge for them. This was what I found during the sort of my thesis, right? But it is an evident problem or limitation that is apparent almost across every single organization, civil society, and youth as well, right? There is a limited capacity number of funds that we can access to. Like, for example, I think the most that you can access through different foundations is like 5,000, right? Right. And it's always project-based rather than continuity, right? There are foundations overseas or democracy groups or civil society outside of Malaysia that do provide funding up to the hundreds of thousands for you to sustain it as the NGOs, but it's very hard, right? One of the best case studies that I've seen about an NGO that has sustained through funding from overseas or external sort of financing would be, for example, like Architects of Diversity, right? And so on, right? But when it comes to environmental organizations, a lot of our funding comes from project-based, right? For example, like this one, right? Like Sustain Kita's projects would come as project-based. You have a certain amount of money and you have a certain period of timeline. But we would have to access a lot of that funds to actually sustain yourself as an organization, to pay for your project coordinators, to pay for your people who do your financial, cataloging, right? People who do your, programs, people who do your HR stuff and so on, right? So those kind of funds don't exist in Malaysia. A lot of the funds from Habitat Foundation, from WWF Malaysia, from Yale is really project-based, right? While that is a good thing, I think we need to start talking about funds or capital that can actually sustain youth organizations, right? We can draw lessons from organizations like Architects of Diversity, Undi 18, about how they actually try to sustain themselves as a civil society. I think that kind of lesson is not really passed down. And I think we have to have a lot of those conversations. And I think for now, we're also not seeing that kind of effort from the federal government in terms of how they want to give capital or investments or grants or seed funding to youth organizations. The NCTF, the National Conservation Trust Fund, used to give funding up to 1 million ringgit to organizations, but now it has stopped, right? So funding will always be a limitation to how young people who are already participants of environmental advocacy can sustain themselves. And I think we need to start pushing for more funding that can sustain organizations. If that is going to be a problem, the best way to sort of move around that, at least in terms of best case scenario, is doing a coalition of youth organizations focusing on the environment. And how that coalition can be funded, can fund almost everyone in terms of project base, right? But that also has its drawbacks. But I think, a lot of the problem would always be the same. A lot of the things that you want to get to fund your organization, to be it for the next 5 years, a lot of that funding comes from the UK, comes from the US, comes from Europe, and so on. So it's very hard and it's very competitive as well, right? You would have to tap into different networks overseas to get that funding when there's so limited funding here, right? So a lot of the responsibility of foundations like Yayasan Hasana, big organizations, the federal government needs to find a way of how they can actually sustain youth organizations focusing on the environment for at least for the next 5 years, instead of like really project based, right? Because I've been there, you guys have been there, a lot of other organizations have been there. So the work is important. The work is valued at 5,000 Malaysian ringgit, but how you compensate your team members is going to be very difficult in that sense. Because I think NGO work is actually formal work. It is work, right? It is employment. It is labor. It is emotional, physical labor. And a lot of people don't tend to see that because of like all they want is impact, right? But we have to reshape the think of how we were to manage an organization and putting value actually at the labor itself as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Aidil. I think you are very spot on that. And honestly, Sustain Kita, we are also a youth-led initiative and we do struggle on funding. So on that, I just want to give a shout out to WWF Malaysia for providing us the seed grant under the Eco Warrior program for us to run events like this and to have amazing speakers who help out on us on this kind of occasions. Another shout out to also to share with Yinson. I think Yinson have a program called Yinson for Youth, initiative that recently started to give 50K, up to 50K grants to organizations every year. So if for those who join, if you have your own youth-led organization, apart from your full-time job, or you have it running as a full-time career itself, stay tuned to opportunity like this. Of course, I agree with Aidil. More action should be taken because we do need more resources to fund more impactful events. And on this occasion, I also want to take this opportunity to thank to Sustain Kita youth ambassadors and also Sustain Kita volunteers as well, who recruited to help us to run events, impactful events like this today. Right? So seeing that we're a little bit short of time, perhaps I'll just go to the last questions. Our final question to wrap up on perhaps advice to give to young people who aspires to be climate advocates, like both of the speakers here today, Dr. Renard and also Aidil, who are very active in this climate change and environmental advocacy scene. So perhaps start off with Dr. Renard. Maybe you can give your advice to the young people, and then I will pass it over to Aidil for his advice.
Yeah, I would probably say one advice that I would give, maybe even to my younger self, is I wish I was a little bit bolder I guess when I was younger, there was always this doubt, right, around, oh, I'm too young, I'm limited by capacity, and what truly can I achieve, right? I think those are very limiting beliefs. I think do try to challenge yourself to step out of your comfort zone a little bit, since this is the start of 2025, right? Someone once told me that if your goals aren't scaring you, you probably aren't being ambitious enough. So and probably that's what you need, right? Like goals that actually scare you a little bit. But be willing to take that first step, and it always seems impossible until it's done. And if there was any message that I would sort of see just based on my years of being in this field, is that I've seen youth, right, really stepping up to the plate, right, and really filling gaps where some of the more mature seasoned professionals failed. And I think with youths, like you have certain strengths that you need to tap on, right? Your innovation, your creativeness, your ability to connect, right, with your demographics, which are going to be future, like decision makers, right, in corporates and CSO settings and government policy making. You need to have that sort of community that you continue to build up. So be bold and don't be afraid to make that first move.
All right, thank you, Dr. Renard. Very nicely, said be bold and to, take action in your capacity and capitalize on your strength as youth. Maybe to Aidil, have any advice to the youth itself?
Yeah, and I think Dr. Renard sort of like has mentioned what I also want to talk about, right? But also, taking radical and bold steps. I think all forms of activism can be really valid, right? Despite the public perception of it. I think one of the things that a lot of people were finding sort of controversial were like the activists who were like throwing like cans of like soup or tomato on artwork, right? But a study was launched of that. It was that it had a radical flank effect where radical activism would translate to people supporting moderate organizations, achieving the same goal that radical activists want, right? So it was quite interesting to see that. So I feel like you would have to have this sort of mindset that try to be an activist in any way, as in any bold capacity as you can, or as little capacity as you can. I think that's really important. But I think the main reason that why we're here is because that because we are a part of a collective, right? It was like sort of like one of my favorite quotes by Angela Davis, who's a feminist, right? Who talks in her book, The Freedom is a Constant Struggle, that it is in collectives that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism, right? So the sense of collectiveness from young people is really important. Try to find your own community, try to find your own organization that you can volunteer with, try to find people that you can mobilize with. Individual actions are important, but when you find a way to connect with people, to create your own community and mobilize together, that's when you protest. That's when you send memorandums. That's when you create impactful programs like this, right? Where that's when you try to mobilize as best as you can. So be in a collective, join a collective, do everything collectively. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Aidil, for your message and advice to the youth itself. It's very important to find your community. I think Sustain Kita wouldn't survive if you wouldn't have the support from, started off four a friends group who are passionate about sustainability after we graduated, and it brings us, to do all this initiative for youth itself, because we are passionate to raise awareness on sustainability and climate change. So right now, I think we are already in the Q&A session. So before I pass the floor over to my colleague Xiao to present the Slido screen, I do notice that there's some questions being sent by the participants in this call itself. I think for one, we have Mr. Ionis. Mr. Ionis is actually my lecturer from University of Nottingham back then. Thank you for joining, Mr. Ionis. He did ask a questions directed to perhaps Dr. Renard on opportunities to contribute to conservation of carbon credits, and Dr. Renard did respond on the chat itself. So thank you for that, Dr. Renard. We also have another question directed to Dr. Renard as well, from Cindy. So she said that there has been many conversation about flood prevention. She was wondering if the government has paid significant attention to city planning or design in this regard. So from her observation, I believe she is currently in Terengganu itself. Despite the flood condition, there are still many large-scale deforestation projects happening everywhere. Maybe we can remember the programs in Genting Highland as well, where there's a protest happening. So is there a channel where youth can voice the concern about township development and planning on this regard? So over to you, Dr. Renard.
Yeah, I guess that's quite an interesting question, right? I think firstly, maybe just to kick off, I would say that there's no limit, right, to youth participation. You just have to be really innovative and creative in terms of how you want to actually approach this subject, right? And there's no one size fits all solution. Start your NGO if you feel like by any means there's a need to do so. If you're asking for sort of my observation in this space, I think on the government side, they know specifically the hotspot areas now that are more prone to floods, and they're trying to set up relief centers. I'd probably say that one key challenge that the government faces is in terms of allocation of funds, probably like where do you prioritize, right? That has always been a key issue that even states have to fight for, right? In terms of financial relief funds. There are certain organizations that are involved in town or city planning. I think REDA being one of them, and there is a very specific youth group under that, especially young professionals within the built environment space, right? I'm talking about like architects, civil engineers, those surveyors, those along that spectrum that are really interested in building a career in real estate or built environment. There is a youth group there, and I think it's this group that I feel needs to really make sure that their voices are heard, right, across master planning, or even when you have green building standards or GBI index, right? Maybe these are the things that you need to fight for in those forums and make sure that they get implemented, right? Or institutionalized, if you like. And then you get conversations around, are we doing enough, right? Through that space. I mean, that's one example that I've heard of. And maybe that's where, for some of you who are interested, that might be a good a starting point to actually get those dialogues and conversation in. I don't know, Aidil, if you have any other suggestions specifically on master planning on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Transit Malaysia does good work. A lot of young people are participating. A lot of young people from undergraduate programs of like city planning, urban planning, and so on are a part of Transit Malaysia. So Transit Malaysia is an advocacy group. They talk about walkability. They talk about public transportation, increasing public transportation infrastructure in Malaysia. About town planning. They're very active. So I would say that if you are really interested in that kind of like environmental conversation on like the urban part of it, you can definitely talk to Transit Malaysia. They were really vocal with the PJD link issue, right? The highway issue that was going to build, the PJD link. They were really huge advocates against the project, right? Focusing on like Malaysia should be KL or the Greater Klang Valley should focus more on public transportation, walkability. So Transit Malaysia is one of those organizations that I feel like you should definitely talk to and have a conversation with.
All right, thank you so much, Aidil and Renard. I think that answer actually the question that we have, the third question that we have on screen right now. Perhaps it's from Cindy. Thank you so much. So right now my colleague have also put up the Slido deck, the screen share that captures questions sent by participants across perhaps YouTube or even on the Zoom call itself. So one question, I believe this question is directed to Aidil. Will a funding mechanism work for I would say NGOs, and making sure that how can we avoid redundancy in actions among youth in climate adaptation NGOs, research or setups. So over to you, Aidil.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't work in the long term wise as much, right? Because like because if you do want to have a crowdfunding sort of mechanism, the transparency level needs to be really, really high, right? You need to really make sure you are using people's money for the right reasons and be accountable for the actions you're doing, the programs and projects that you're doing, right? It's you need to be careful when it comes to crowdfunding. I think crowdfunding it's going to be a blended thing, right? You need crowdfunding, you need funding from seed grants, like through programs initiated like from WWF Malaysia, through Yale, through Yinson, right? So you need those. It needs to be a blended sense of financing, I think, that to be successful. But transparency, accountability should be your priority, especially when you're relying on crowdfunding mechanisms lah. But how can we avoid sort of like redundancy? I think especially when it comes to young people having a lot of like about climate action projects, right? There's a lot of organizations started by young people in Malaysia right now focusing on climate change, like Youth, MYD, Sustain Kita, Climate Action, Kelab Belia Prihatin, Kolektif Iklim. So how do you sort of like avoid redundancy? I don't think redundancy is an issue, right? Because I think we all need to talk about the same things. I think we need to build pressure on that. But one of the best ways, at least, to become very niche and specialized is to find your own niche lah, or your specialty. Climate Action focuses a lot on eco-feminist values or feminist climate justice angles. A lot of their work focuses on gender. A lot of their work focuses on marginalized communities like orang asli people, right? They really try to frame their organization and make their work as intersectional. They participate not only in climate change negotiations, they also participate at gender conversations at the UN level, right? Through the Geneva Convention. Right. So you have to be niche like that in that sense. Like MYD also has its niche. It's really focused on policy. It's really focused on negotiations at the UN climate change level and so on, right? So try to find your niche, right? At least for us at Kolektif Iklim, we want to focus it on biodiversity and climate action and merging them together, right? So that's at least a good way for you to find. There are a lot of other niche topics. You can talk about the legal aspect of climate change. You can talk about other creative ways. For example, one of the creative ways that climate action or Kami is doing is trying to talk about poetry and literature and writing about climate change, right? So develop those kind of niche is really important for you to at least to diversify yourself from other organizations. But I don't think it's wrong to become redundant in this space because I feel like we all need to pressure for the same thing.
All right, thank you so much, Aidil. Thank you for that. Very good take on the questions. We do have another questions actually on carbon credit trading system. Perhaps I think that's directed to Dr. Renard. Dr. Renard, maybe in your perspective, what are the key challenges Malaysia face in implementing a mandatory carbon trading system? And do you think, as a nation, are we ready for it?
Oh yeah, before I address that question, maybe I just wanted to build a little bit on what Aidil has said, right? So having been on the opposite end, right, of assessing, grants, one of the things that I have come across is double dipping, right? So a similar project, request for funding, going through, like different routes, right, specifically to fund something that's quite similar. And so happened I was sitting on two different committees, right? And I saw the same project proposal came in. I think also be very careful with that because credibility is very important. Be very transparent with your select committee when you're submitting such proposals, right? If you're applying for multiple grants. Just going back to the question around some of the key challenges in implementing a mandatory carbon trading system. I think this was something that was highlighted in the National Climate Change Policy 2.0. There was already interest in saying that, the government is interested in establishing an emissions trading scheme in Malaysia, but that we have to wait. What will come first is the carbon tax, right? So in budget 2025, I think our Prime Minister already announced that 3 sectors, iron, steel, and energy sectors, right, will first be impacted by the carbon tax that is coming. So this would be a precursor, right, to moving towards the emissions trading scheme. I think, what will happen is that a lot of corporates, right, are probably in a fear mode, right, because they don't know what would hit them. They're questioning around how much, they would have to incur as a result of this carbon tax that's coming. And how much credits can they actually purchase, right, in order to offset some of those emissions? At the moment, I think there is still a fair bit to do in terms of raising awareness, in terms of the sort of capacity building that's required. And you will see, right, certain quarters sort of challenging, right? Why do we need to have a carbon tax? Why do we need to have an emissions trading scheme? How are they different? Even as we speak now, right, people can't even distinguish between the difference between carbon credits versus renewable energy certificates or RECs. So there's all these different financial mechanisms that have come up to the fore, right? And people need to know how are they, distinctive, how are they different? and in what situations can they actually use it for. I think we really have to work towards building that sort of awareness and capacity, right, in order to address some of the misconceptions on the carbon trading space. So if you ask me, at this point in time, you have a mixed bag. You have corporates that are very self-initiated, who are on the other end of the spectrum, like you have those who have no idea at all, right, about carbon trading or carbon credits. So I guess MCMA's role is really trying to breach this gap, right, in the market.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Renard. I think one final question for the Q&A, it's from Iqbal, directed to you as well on relevant topics. So he wanted to know perhaps what are a few planned engagement activities for 2025 by MCMA, and like maybe perhaps how youth could join those events if it's open to them.
Yeah, one of the things that took place at COP29, right, the Conference of Parties in Baku, was actually a memorandum of exchange between 4 countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand. So we have already committed that in 2025, right, during Malaysia's chairmanship year of ASEAN, we will continue to drive a lot of capacity building initiatives. We will also try to explore, right, a pilot program in order for us to operationalize what we consider the ASEAN Common Carbon Framework. So just to give you a bit of flavor, currently Indonesia and Thailand have their own national standards, right, for carbon projects. We feel that Malaysia really needs to step up to mutually recognize these methodologies and to adapt what's suitable for our own context. Currently, we have nothing, right? At all at a national level, and we're relying on independent standards like RERA to dictate how forests, like management, reforestation should be run. And this is perhaps would be an issue, right, for countries that are constantly promoting things like forest sovereignty. We need to have a say in terms of how our forest is managed, or even issues around funding, right? When you deploy independent standards, what happens is that you actually have to pay money, right, for verification and validation, and that outflow, right, is very weird when it goes from global south to the global north, when in actual fact we're trying to get the reverse, trying to get the global north to support a lot of the conservation-based activities, right, in Malaysia. Conservation is a long-haul game, yeah. It's not something that's going to happen in 5 years. Like project developers are in this, right, know that you're talking about a 20, 30 year sort of time frame. And some of them say, hey, we're not even going to be here in the next 30 years, right? So why should we be involved in this? And it's a huge stumbling block and obstacle. So on this front, I think MCMA is also trying to spur, right, more collaboration and cooperation among ASEAN countries. Now, one thing that I've highlighted that which might be quite interesting to explore, and I haven't actually, to be very frank, right, thought about this yet, is perhaps youth involvement, right, in trying to promote carbon market initiatives, right? So one example that I've typed in the chat was the Indonesian Carbon Trade Association, which is also one of our counterparts in the MOC exchange, right, have started a youth group. It's primarily to build up capacity, right, for the next generation of, like carbon developers and leaders, right, who are interested in this space and wanting to learn more. So they've started a mini youth group there, and maybe, just maybe, we could explore and see if there's an opportunity to replicate that within, like MCMA. I'm not sure if there's any of you that are interested in pursuing this, right? Maybe we can connect. I don't know, through LinkedIn or whatever means of medium, just drop me a message, and then we can see how we can connect and have a further discussion. I think the key idea is that, we might need, youths that are really passionate about, this topic, that are willing to step in and also to bridge the gap, I suppose, with NGOs, right? So as I've mentioned that, during one of our discourse, when the Kwame Rainforest Conservation Project first had its auction, right, a day before, there was a protest on how carbon credits, should not even be used as a mechanism or regime, right? But I feel we really need to sort of start bridging those conversations and dialogue as well, so that there is a little bit more understanding, a two-way understanding, I guess, addressing the concerns that some of the CSOs has versus what are some of the facts, right, that we are confronted with. We need to have that in order for us to advance and to progress, and of course to have global self-representation. Yeah.
I see. Thank you so much, Dr. Renard. And again, our big thank you to Aidil as well for joining this webinar today. I think that is the end of our Q&A session. And before we, finish this call, from Sustain Peter's side, we have one final request for the participants, which is to share your feedback to us. So allow me to share my screen to flash the QR code for you to scan. All right. So if you're able to see the screen right now, we appreciate if you can take up your phone, scan this QR code, and let us know. Perhaps what do you think about this event? How have it impacted you? Have you learned something here today? And of course, otherwise, you can always click on the link that I have sent in the chat for this call. If not, I think my colleague will also send the same link as well again in the chat for you to click onto it. And we appreciate your 2 minutes time to fill up this QR code. Yeah. So in the meanwhile, while you are filling up this QR code, I'd like to express again our gratitude to both Dr. Renard and Aidil for taking time out on a Saturday to join this call. So your perspective, thought leadership has been immensely impactful and beneficial to everyone here, including myself as well. And I've learned so much from both of these panelists. You know, you two are very esteemed stars in the climate field, and we need people like you to continue do your good work to advocate and to push forward the climate change biodiversity conservation agenda. All right. So with that, I think once you have scanned this QR code, you are free to drop off the call. We thank you so much for joining us. And for those who join us live on YouTube, we thank you as well for listening in and to ask questions that you have to our both our speakers. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Aidil. Thank you, Dr. Renard.
Thank you. Take care now. Bye.
Thank you.